Welcome back, Wanderer, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today, we're going to explore the untamed realms of survival gaming, guided by the wisdom of Bill Roper. With a storied career spanning decades, Bill has left his mark on the gaming landscape, contributing to titles such as Warcraft, Diablo, and Starcraft. Now, as the CEO of Lunacy Games, he ventures into new territory with an upcoming survival game. Bill, thank you for joining me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to this, Gerald. I love talking about games and about the industry and everything else, so thanks for the forum.
You are 100% in the right place then, because I love talking about games and stories too. But as you were mentioning, you have bona fides in tabletop role-playing, digital games, you have had your fingers Disney all over the place. Today we're going to talk rather specifically about environmental storytelling in survival games, because this is an area you have expertise, and the studio you have founded is working in that vein. But before we dig into the topic of the day, I would love to get to know Bill a little better. Set the stage for me. How did you fall in love with gaming and writing? What was the journey to get you to where you are today, and what are you up to today?
Well, the journey began when I was very, very young. Just the love for gaming. My parents, to teach me math skills, better basic math skills, taught me card games. So I played cribbage with my mom. So that was a lot of 15s and 31s and recognizing pairs of numbers and quick addition. And my dad taught me blackjack, because that was a different set of numbers and, matching and recognition. And so I always credited / blamed them for that. Interestingly enough, they had a good friend who worked at that time, very unknown in the U.S. company called Atari. And we actually had one of the first home Pong that first year it came out. They were like, "Hey, do you think your son might think this is fun?" And they were like, "Sure." So I had that very, very vague memory of sitting there on a Christmas morning, plugging this thing into the television and just being amazed that it was doing what it was doing, that ball of light bouncing back and forth. So all through growing up, all through, high school, I always look at 1977 as being a pretty seminal year for me in both gaming and storytelling and writing. It was the year I started playing D&D. It was the year I started playing Traveler. And it was where I, on an amazing experience with my mom, went and on opening weekend saw Star Wars. So that year was just so foundational. I was 12, and what a perfect time to have something happen in your life. I've also always been very invested in music and storytelling that happens through song, both music and lyrically. Went into college, kind of got out of. I was still playing PC games, but, and some console, not a lot of tabletop. In college with my flatmate, he was running a tabletop group, predominantly GURPS, and we played a ton of that. And I got back into it while I was a vocal major at Cal State Long Beach. And then another good friend of mine during all that time was working at that time, unknown company, pretty unknown, that had just changed their name to Blizzard. And he said, "Hey, we've got, some contract work that needs to get done." And so I did the music as a contractor for Blackthorn, for the PC version of it. And then they were also going to be showing off their first original game that they were doing, what they were going to be publishing, called Warcraft, Orcs Humans. And they needed someone to do some voiceover. And so I sent in a demo reel, and I think it was because I was cheap and I already had a contract with them, so it was pretty easy just to bring me in. But I went in and sat down with Glenn Stafford, who was the sound director at the time, their sound guy, and we sat in his office, which was basically literally a closet, because it was the quietest room in the whole office they had. And he converted it, and it was about as wide as his desk, and we're sitting shoulder to shoulder, and he's got a computer up. And he'd have to spin around in his chair and reach behind him to do things on the board and then spin back around. It was a pretty comedic setup. And there's this first intro that he's showing me where this camera's flying through some trees and coming up to the front of a castle, and the drawbridge lowers. And I mean, it's like Minecraft quality at this point. But back in, 1994, this was insane graphics to be seeing on a computer. And he said, okay, great. So here's where we're going to talk about there's orcs and they're fighting humans. I was like, is there a script? He said, no, we don't have a script. So I sat down and wrote a bunch of stuff, like sitting next to him. And that was where that in the age of chaos, 2 factions battled for dominance all came from. And I just did the voice and the whole thing. And it was for a promo they were going to be showing at Summer CES in their little 10-foot by 10-foot booth to get people excited about this game that they were going to be putting out. And they'd just been acquired by Davidson and Associates, which was an educational software company, but saw that there was going to be something about this whole games industry that they thought could be big.
Mm-hmm.
So they had just acquired Silicon and Synapse, which changed their name to Blizzard. And this was their first thing they were going to be publishing, like self-publishing as Blizzard. And so I did that. I finished all my contract work. I wrote an impassioned letter to Alan Adham, who's the president at the time, and Mike Morheim, who's the VP at the time, and I've been working with. And I said, look, I'll do anything to work here. I'll run your bulletin board. I'll do QA testing. I promised Alan I would wash his car. I told Mike I would give him a Rock Hydra because Magic the Gathering was brand new, and that was a big, awesome card at the time. And they decided that, sure, you know what? This guy seems to get it. When they hired me, I took a pay cut from working at Kinko's Copies, doing desktop publishing, to go work at Blizzard. And the first thing I did there as an official member of the company was I sat in Alan's office and he said, hey, did you write that script, for the voiceover for that? And I said, yeah, I did. He said, great. Because really all we have for any kind of lore or setting stuff is that it's orcs, they're fighting humans, and the bad guy's name is Blackhand. So my first official job was to do all of the writing for the very first game. So all the lore building, naming all the characters, all the places, coming up with all the missions and everything, because they would have missions built out and they could kind of talk to me like, oh yeah, well this is how the mission runs. So I had to put all the lore around it. And that was starting my career. And I remember I'd been a music major. I was, like everybody in LA, a struggling either actor or a musician. I was on the musician side. And I remember calling my mom and telling her, hey, I think I might have found a job that I want to make a career. I could see doing this for a long time. And she's like, really? Oh, what's that? And I think she was really kind of they were always amazingly supportive, but I'm sure she was kind of secretly happy that oh, maybe Bill's going to give up this, I'm going to go be a musician in LA thing for some kind of good, steady work. And she said, so what are you going to do? I said, oh, I'm going to make video games. And there was this pause. And then she said, your father and I love you very much. They were just unbendingly supportive, even when they didn't even really understand what the heck it was I was about to go do. But, I've been doing it for 30 years now and got the opportunity to work at Blizzard for 9, went and started my own studio with Dave Brevik and Erica Max Schaefer, who were the guys from Blizzard North at Diablo. We had flagship studios where we did Hellgate London. I worked at Cryptic Studios for a couple of years doing MMOs, so working on Champions Online and Star Trek Online and starting Neverwinter before I left. I was at Disney for 5.5 years, where the big thing we did there was Disney Infinity. So got to be, in the leaders in that Toys to Life space and just made amazing lifelong connections there and got to work with people and on projects and with characters and worlds I could have never imagined I would have had the chance to touch. Yeah. After Disney, kind of stopped making games and went to just licensing, took the opportunity with my family to do the expat experience and was in London for a couple of years at Improbable, which is fairly well known, at least in the industry, UK unicorn company doing massive cloud compute infrastructure for games. And after a couple of years there, wanted to move back to the States, be closer to people we knew. Did a startup in Washington for about 3 years. had that moment where it was like we got our first round of funding, super excited, ready to go sign a lease on a building. And the day before we were supposed to sign was the first stay-at-home order, because this was 2020. And thank goodness we thought maybe we should hold off on signing that lease. It's only 6 weeks. Let's see what happens. We all kind of know what happened. So, but I was up there for 3 years, and then we moved back to Southern California. And now I've got a new studio I'm starting up, with some longtime industry friends. And, one of the things that happened during that height of COVID was, of course, we couldn't get together, couldn't spend time playing tabletop RPGs, playing board games, all those things normally we just hang out and do to kind of bond and spend time with each other. So, of course, we played tons of online games. And we really kind of fell in love with the survival genre. We played thousands and thousands of hours of various survival games and really enjoyed the collaborative nature of it, the cooperative elements of working together to build something, that creative payoff for doing all that survival crafting and building. And not to be too esoteric, but when we talked about what we wanted to do, when we finally said, hey, we've been playing all these survival games, like, let's go make one, and build a company to do that, is the things that we appreciated about it while we were playing, during COVID, that connection and that community you could build. I look at where the world is, and between social media and politics, everything's about extreme sides, right? Pulling people apart, because that's where all the clicks and likes and follows and everything happen, is your most extreme nature. And we were like, we want to build games where people are working together to do something. And so that's been a big part of kind of our journey over the last year.
I love that. You're like my perfect guest. Like, we could have 4 different episodes, because I'm a huge Disney person, so I'd love to know what you did there and talk about that more. And Toys' Games, our Skylander collection's massive, so that's the thing. And then Hellgate London, I was a Hellgate London early adopter, and I was there when the server shut off. Like, I was crying. So
yeah, you both.
There's probably you more than me, but there was an investment there. But we're here today to talk about, like, you're so wisely leading into survival games. Before we even jump into it, though, I have to know. You mentioned you guys were playing a lot of survival games. What games were you into? What was the big ones?
Probably the 3 we put at that time. We were putting the most time into 7 Days to Die, of course, Valheim, and Conan Exiles.
Nice.
And they all had definitely different things they bring to the party, and there were things we liked about all of them, and things that we didn't like about them, and then things we wondered why they did it, went one way in their choices of design and not the other way. And as we just naturally, because we're designers and developers, we like deconstruct everything. Right? It's like if you're a chef and you go have dinner, and like if it's a great meal, you're like, oh, what did they use there? I wonder why they made that choice. Wow, what an interesting idea. I wonder how that would pair with this. And it was that curiosity and play that led us to be like, oh, if we did this is how we would approach it. And then it was not that further of a leap to go, we should just go do this, as opposed to just talking about what would it be like.
So you avoided the more toxic ones like DayZ and that ilk?
Yeah, I mean, we dipped our toes into everything. We played tons of other stuff. We played Grounded and like,
that's fine,
and Shrouded. Like anytime there was a Western based survival game that I always struggle to remember the name of, that was unfinished. We found it on Steam, and you can tell the dev team worked on it for a couple of years and released it, like got it to an early access, and then it was just kind of abandonware. And it was definitely like the bones of something pretty interesting. But it's for us, it was, we always wanted to play more so in the games where we could spin up a server. It could just be us playing, as opposed to, like Rust, where you're kind of at the mercy of whoever you happen to run into on a server, or Arc times, right? But anything where we could run our own server, because for us, it was, about spending time with each other, right, and the collaborative nature of it, as opposed to the more combative, competitive, and usually, or at least the much more of a possibility of, toxic nature that stems out of that.
Was Minecraft also a kind of a beginning point for you guys as well?
I mean, we'd all played Minecraft. We didn't actually play much Minecraft together, right? We'd all played a lot of it previously, and liked a lot of the stuff that was there. We all dabbled in Roblox. Like, you want to look at the builders, and how they're doing stuff, but we were really focused on a more like high fidelity experience. And there's definitely game mechanic things you get out of games like Minecraft, especially. But it was interesting, after a while, the core mechanics of what a survival game is start to become pretty known, right? Like, there's just things you're going to do that are going to be expected as a baseline for survival games. And as we've been working on the one that we're building now at the studio, that's kind of the last thing we explore. Like, there's more crafting survival game elements we can do in our engine than we built art for, because we know we don't have to go figure that part out. Like, we know how that's going to work. Yes, you're going to mine things, and you're going to harvest things, and you're going to use those at a, in some way to then make the next thing. Like, those are all, those are become, for the most case, more aesthetic choices that you're making. Is it a workbench? Is it a kiln? Is it an open fire? Like, where you're putting it, but the underlying mechanics of it don't require much exploration. How you want to express that, what's the nuances and differences in how you're doing that, or where are you putting your twists and your innovation, is what becomes important. And so that's, for us, been more the focus on just kind of the core, the core mechanic.
Very cool. I would love to ask if you've seen any interesting variations on the idea of, gather, refine, build, upgrade, but I don't want to dig into that because you guys are probably working on stuff. So it's an interesting...
And actually, one of our, when we talk with, investors and publishers, if there's, of the three big things I point out as unique features, one of them is what we're doing for resource gathering and crafting.
Nice.
So, because I think it's such a huge component of it, and that's probably one of the things that is kind of the most samey across a lot of survival games.
Oh yeah,
right. So we definitely have a different take on how we do that.
Very cool. Very cool. I like Nightingale. It's the studio's local, Inflection's local to me, so I'm a big fan. Followed them forever, play the game. So
yeah, I mean, I know Aaron pretty well, who heads the studio. In fact, that studio got spun up by an investment from Improbable. So Aaron and I worked together there, and then after I'd left, they ended up pivoting, and Aaron and the crew, got out, and I was super excited to see them get Nightingale released. I mean, there's the core, like, lore and theme that never wavered. And I always thought the setting was super interesting.
So good.
One of the things that I think they've brought to the table in survival games is like a beautiful setting, like a fidelity, right, in graphics. And that's something we're definitely focused on. We've talked now openly about that. Our setting is an American Old West. And, one of the comparisons I make is that it's grounded in a reality and has a visual fidelity of something like a Red Dead Redemption 2, right? Because I think that game you felt very immersed in the setting because you knew what things were. There was a reality that you got to, get grounded on, no matter what other weird stuff was happening and adventures you were going on. But it was also just a graphically rich setting. And with all the tools that are available to us as developers, you can really make the stylistic choices. You can go the direction you really want to go. And so for us, that's just an area we haven't seen as much focus on with survival games. So I think it's something that will be fun for us to explore and, help us stand out, hopefully.
I'm sure. Okay, well, let's dig into the topic of the day and not to worry too much about what you're doing at the studio there, so that we're not digging into that. So let's talk about storytelling. You have a very rich background. It kills me. You were an English or a music. You were doing music in the studio to do voiceover and ended up being a writer. Like that. That's great.
Yeah, it's interesting. I from when I was very, very young, I read a lot. My parents read to me a lot. When I was in junior high school and high school, not only was I was doing a lot of music, I did a lot of writing. I always excelled more at the English side of the fence than the mathematics side of the fence. Language was always much more of my friend in that way. Went through my hundreds of very poorly written songs. Every now and then I'll go back and find something and go like, oh, that one line was pretty good. Boy, the rest of it is like so 17, but so expression, through lyrics, which is interesting from the standpoint that it's writing and your storytelling, but it has usually some fairly strict guidelines and guardrails, right? Like you are working within a scansion that has to be performable. There's a rhyming schema that you're creating and following. I always think design is much more interesting when you have guardrails and guidelines. Like the worst question I get asked is like, if you could make any game you want, no matter what it was, right? No budget limits, everything else. It's just like I don't know. It's just like, it's much more intriguing to me to be, here's a theme you have to be creating to under this timeline or this restriction, and you can't do this, you can't do these things, because that's where the creativity lies, right? Is in those corners and those edge cases, and how do you do something really different and interesting with a limited set of tools. And so for me, writing has always been that way, whether it's been music or whether it's been, I remember when I was in high school, we had to do a book report on 1984. And so I would do weird things like challenge myself to write the entire book report in Newspeak.
Almost.
Or we had to do one where we had to write an assignment that was, you had to write a letter. It was creative writing. You had to write a letter to a loved one. And so my mom worked at Portis Dow, which was a subsidiary of Dow Chemical that did artificial kidneys. And the cases for the kidneys were these like clear tubes that had these like red twist on edges. So they had this really cool, almost sci-fi look.
Mm-hmm.
So the letter I wrote was from a deep space like astronaut whose ship had sustained damage and was going to be spinning out of basically out into the galaxies, never to return. And so this was the message tube that was ejected and then came back to Earth. So I wrote it, put it in there, and then much to my parents' chagrin, went outside and took some fire to it, so it looked like it re-entered. And they're like, "What do you think? It's plastic?" And I'm like, and then that's what I turned it into my project, right? So for me, there was always I was always interested in the presentation of it as well as what the words were, and I think that tied in very much with my theatrical nature and my musical upbringing, and I really became where, when I had the opportunity then to write in longer form, that's just where my mind would tend to go. Is what's the interesting twist on this, whether that's setting or characters or format that's being used. So it's going to be presenting very differently. So I kind of think all those things have blended together, right? I'm also on the tabletop side, on the role-playing side. I am what is known as a forever GM, because I find that about 90% of what I do is GMing. So for better or worse, I get to create a lot of storylines and then collaboratively tell those stories with the people around the table, which I also adore. And I think it's one of the strengths that tabletop games have over video games, is that actual interaction where the story and the NPCs, the characters, can turn on a dime in direct reaction to what the main characters, your protagonists, which are the players, are doing. And I think that's a kind of a golden egg that we've all been chasing on the video game side, And what we found is that video games now are like great at talking, right? Like you can watch cinematic sequences or like get involved in deep storylines on games, and the writings just become fantastic in that way. The worlds and characters they build. I think it's one of the reasons that video games are kind of the darling of Hollywood right now. Like if you're watching the Fallout series, holy smokes, that is like such an amazing translation of that world. But it can be that because that world is so rich and the storytelling they've done there is so rich. But on the flip side, NPCs in video games are not good at listening, right? That's certainly something that is a big thing that's getting tackled right now, right? With Gen AI companies like InWorld and what they're doing with Ubisoft and things where they're like, hey, can we have more of a conversation occurring, right? But there's deeper levels to that I'm excited to think that in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, what a video game experience is like, especially in a role-playing game, is going to be vastly different than it is today.
Wow. That's fascinating. Wow. There's a lot there. I want to break apart parts, and I have questions on so many things. I don't want to focus on survival storytelling anymore, but quickly backing up 3 steps, tabletop role-playing games. Have you play and you have your home game and your own built world. Have you published anything? Have you my research, I didn't dig into that side of you.
Yeah, I've published a couple supplements and things. I have, like, I think many people in the tabletop space, and I know, like, have those 1 or 2 projects that are always on the back burner and slowly building. I've been slowly building a fantasy setting for an awfully long time. And I think it always becomes this matter of focus, right? And it's amazing to see what's happened in that space, or the tabletop gaming space over the last 5 to 8 years has really exploded, and not only is there, of course, the rise of the 500-pound gorilla, from the folks at Wizards of the Coast, but the just massive amounts of incredibly good indie games that come out, and even seeing other game systems and other companies like, Paizo or Savage Worlds, or ones that are, there's like D&D, and then there's this next segment of big, well-known, well-supported games, and then there's a massive sea of indie games. But within those, the thing I'm fascinated by is the storytelling that gets done can be very specific, right? You're like, here is a game about this very particular experience. And so it's fascinating to look at that and say, like, I really should, you can pretty basically say, like, oh, I wish I could play a game where I was an explorer in the 1500s that runs across a camp of Mayan zombies that time travel. I'll guarantee you someone's written that game somewhere out there. You just have to find it. And I think it's fascinating because so many times they look for different mechanics to express that storytelling in. I'm a longtime lover of Traveler, which interestingly came out the same year that Dungeons & Dragons did. It's like just as old as D&D. And it's a sci-fi system that famously amongst tabletop players had originally for many, many, many years, you could die during character generation. And that was kind of the thing it got known for. Like anytime you tell people Traveler, oh, that one where you die when you make a character, like not so much anymore, but yes, that is it. And so I've published a couple supplements for that. My wife and I, during the pandemic, started a little tiny publishing thing called Wonder Monkey. And so I did a supplement for Traveler with that. And, we've got like two or three other things just kind of slowly moving along in the background that will probably come out someday. But I've spent a lot of my time in that space streaming games and doing podcasts and doing streaming, initially all podcast driven, and then Twitch when that started to become a thing, on a couple of different now networks, I guess. They're just people sitting around a table when we started. And it's been really fun to see other people that very early on we talked to about doing storytelling around that setting go on to have very big, well-known careers for that. There's a podcast that the first one I ever did, because it was one of the first ones that ever came out. It's called Happy Jack's RPG podcast. And my roommate from college and the guy that I started a band with that's been playing for the last 30 years at Renaissance fairs, started doing it in his garage and with just podcasting, and then started, like, as soon as you could stream games, started filming games and streaming them. And, way, way back in the day, for example, because we knew him from Renaissance Fair, we had Matt Mercer on when he was talking about, some friends of mine were talking about getting together and maybe like playing and streaming, like, before there was a Critical Role, just talking about it and stuff like that. So it's been really exciting to see those people that, for whatever weird reason in life, go on to do that and do, just incredible storytelling through that medium. So, I've spent more time, I think, doing like predominantly like live storytelling than I have been like capturing things and writing them in that way.
Really cool. So just so I can throw it in the show notes, you currently got a stream runnings, like, is there?
I do, yeah. I'm currently, like, every Wednesday, 1:30 Pacific, 4:30 Eastern, on Severed Studios, where we're doing, interestingly enough, the Netherdeep campaign, which was in D&D that was put out by the Critical Role folks. And I think we just had episode, I think, 80, 81. Very long-form campaign. And I play Orgoth Skullcrusher, who is half orc, half drow, fighter, barbarian, with all kinds of stuff. And for me, like, it was a really interesting exploration because I wanted to play somebody who was mixed heritage. He's 16, so I wanted to tap into what it was like having all that weird confusion in your life when you think that you're far more adult than you are.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, like, everyone else in the group was races that can be much, much older. So that's a really been a fun storytelling divide to jump as well. When there's a couple elves in the party that are hundreds of years old and they'll start talking about things, I'm just like, I don't know what that is. And so that's been a blast. I do that quite a bit. And then I do appear on the Happy Jacks RPG advice show, which is how they do tons of streaming and tons of other stuff. But that network started as a weekly advice show for GMs. So, and they've been doing that for 12 years, I think now. They were like very, very, very early on in the podcasting phenomenon. And so, those are the two places where I am predominantly located. And then I'm doing a lot of stuff on YouTube now too, which you might like because I'm talking an awful lot about Disney Infinity right now.
Oh, well, I'm going to go check that out right now. Well, okay, not right now, but after we're done. Okay, well, we need to... There's a title to this episode, something about survival games and environmental storytelling.
Yeah, that definitely works with me because I talk a lot about a lot of stuff. I apologize for that, Gerald. But sure, let's get back to the title. Let's go back to what we're supposed to talk about.
Do not apologize at all. I love rabbit holes. I know somebody's going to be like, hey, I wanted to hear about environmental storytelling, and it's 30 minutes in. So let's focus back a little bit. You have incredible experience in storytelling in general across multiple forms. So let's bring that into the genre of survival games. And when I think survival games, I played I played all of them, but DayZ comes to my mind because I played a bunch of it. The Long Dark, games like this where there isn't anybody telling you the story. You have to stumble across scenes that'll give you hints. You have to find things. So let's lean into that. Let's talk a little bit about that. How do you approach integrating storytelling into the environment of a game like this, where it's all about exploration, it's all about discovery?
Yeah, it's one of the ways I really love doing storytelling. And I've done a lot of the other side of the fence. I was there when we were doing Diablo, and it was radical that we're like, oh my gosh, look, there's an exclamation point above somebody's head. And then you go and talk to them and get your missions and your quests and your lore bits. And that's absolutely not anything we're focused on doing now, because one of the things I do love about environmental storytelling is having the world unfold to the player while they explore, right? Like storytelling through exploration is such a bigger payoff. It is harder at times to right to and to achieve, because by definition, it is based on where the player decides to go. So you don't really know maybe what they've done or haven't done. And there's ways you can, work around that by flagging things on the player character file. I mean, there's mechanical, technological ways to say, oh, I know that they've done this or haven't done this, or been here or haven't been here, and then reflect that in what is said. But the thing that I like about that kind of storytelling is that it's not about balance. It's not about linear path. It's about finding out things about the world, right? And you're showing, not telling. So when in the demo we built for GDC, as an example, as you come down into this valley, you see that there's a wagon by the side of the road that's burned out and it's still smoking slightly. And you're like, what is that? Right? And so you get off your horse and you walk over, and then you discover there's this kind of poor, unfortunate soul by the side of the wagon who's obviously, met their ill-timed fate. And there is kind of another surprise there that you're like, what the hell is that? And you try to drive it off. And then you find a backpack that's, in the back of the wagon that you can take. And those all are things that, in my mind, then, as you're creating that moments of storytelling, what happened to the wagon? What happened to the traveler? Did the thing that I scared off kill him? Was it attracted to a body because it's hungry? What's in the backpack? Does that have any clues, right? And so, but these are then all things where the other part for me of environmental storytelling comes in, is it then feeds player agency. As the player, I could just elect to go like, well, that was neat, got a backpack, and off I go.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could chase down this thing that I scared off, or I could examine the area more and see if there's clues, right? And so, like one of my favorite moments ever in a Bethesda game was and it was in one of the Elder Scrolls settings, right? And I can never remember which game it was. It's the one where you start on the boat and you're a prisoner and they drop you off. I can never remember which one of the games it is. But I'm wandering around the environment. I'm just walking around with my character, and I hear this off in the distance. When I kind of see something fall somewhere, I'm like, hell, I run up there, and there's a mage on the ground who just obviously is splatted. And I'm like, what the hell? What's this? And so I inspect the body, and there's basically like a robe and a pair of boots and a note. So being a good RPG player, I take everything. And then I'm like, and the boots are like, they're magical boots. All right, that's interesting. And then there's a note, and I can read the note, because that's one of the things, as part of their environmental storytelling, Bethesda loves to do, which is just like, here's a massive amount of world lore spread across like books and notes and tapes and, just like find all this stuff and read it or don't read it or whatever. But there's far more lore than maybe you'll ever be able to actually absorb. But there's this note, and the note basically is kind of a memo from the wizard to himself. That's like his logbook, and he's like, I believe that I have perfected the boots of jumping. Not quite sure how the landing will go, is basically the gist of the note. And I was like, God, that's hilarious. What a funny little moment. If you put the boots on, you get this jump spell. And if you use it, it will launch your butt like way high and far across the map. And then you will die when you land. Now, if you elect to keep those boots through a good portion of the game, at some point, you actually get the ability to learn basically a featherfall spell. And now, many, 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 many hours after you first found them, you have a way to traverse big distances on the map. Now, I've already got fast travel by this point, but so they know they're not breaking anything, but it's such an amazing, this has stuck with me for probably 20 years, right? It's this amazing moment, this little story of like who, and then you're like, this is wizard. Like, why would he have done, And then you're like, am I going to do it? What am I going to take on with that? I happened to not sell them. I talked with friends of mine that had played, and they were like, yeah, I knew right away what happened. And I was like, screw that. And I sold them. And I was like, dude, I got to like level 33 and I got this spell, and now I can use them to go pretty much anywhere on the map. And they're like, what? And so you get this great moment of, I had a different experience, even with this 3 minutes that's in the game that, lasted me across the entirety of my play and separated what I experienced from my friends who played. To me, those are key parts of environmental storytelling. Just give people nuggets and kernels and rabbit holes and let them explore them or not at their pace. And then your job from the writing side is to make sure that all those things fit a consistent world narrative, right? They all have their place in it. So if you were to just spread everything out across a massive imaginary table, you'd be like, oh, I kind of get I understand how these are all part of the same place, right? Internal consistency is the biggest thing you have to do in environmental storytelling, because you can kind of get away with everything as long as it makes sense in the world, right? And that also tells you what you can't get away with.
Right. I love how that moment, that story that you took away from that game has no impact on the plot or any of the bigger picture. It's just a thing that was there and you discovered it and now you have a story. I love that about games. That's amazing.
There's so much about environmental storytelling that candidly isn't about the main plot, right? It's the moments that add depth and color and texture to a world, right? It's not the road you're walking on to get from point A to point B. That's the burden of the main storyline. It's the rocks and the trees and the weather and the clouds and the animals. It's like everything around that road that are all those other little bits. And to me, those are the things that add massive amounts of life to a world. And that's a big focus for what we want to do. Is like, I love environmental storytelling, and that's when we look at, kind of what our three, when you do the shorthand, right? Anytime you're talking about a game you're building or a book you're writing, you always try to have shorthand for people. So for us, we talk about, well, we want to have the grounded in reality and the digital fidelity of Red Dead Redemption 2, the exploration and environmental storytelling of something like Skyrim. Right? So I think that game's just incredibly deep, and you go back and play it again and again and again. You keep finding these little like nooks and crannies you didn't somehow not see the last 7 times you played. And then of all the survival games we played, there was a lot of things we really liked about Conan Exiles. We took a lot from everything we've played. We've taken, inspiration and moments, but there was just a lot of elements of Conan we liked. And I'm very excited about Dune Awakening, because I think they're going to take what they started in Conan and just like refine it like spice. And, and Dune Awakening is going to be great.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
But the push, for me has always been, what can you do in the environment that just adds all that? If you go all the way back to, I would say as early as Warcraft 2, right? The original Warcraft had basically 2 voices. There's the orc and the human, right? That was what we did. We got to Warcraft 2, it was like, well, we're going to have a lot more, we want to represent the units a lot more broadly, like character art for each of the units, a voice for each of the units. Like, we wrote specific things for the units, right? But so even in a game that was a strategy, a real-time strategy game, you had this texture of the characters by exploring them. And, even in terms of like explorative storytelling, you go all the way back to the original Warcraft, and that was Glenn and I sitting in his studio, and I had noticed by playing the game that when I was waiting for things to build, I would just sit and click, just mindlessly just click when I was waiting. It was like a nervous tick. And I said, wouldn't it be funny if you just clicked on a character a bunch, like they broke the fourth wall and got pissed off at you? And so, yeah. So we recorded these, what we call pissed lines. and then worked with Bob Fitch, who was one of the engineers. I think Bob is still there. And we said, hey, we want to put this in the build and then not tell anybody and see if they find it. And back in those days, virality was when someone saw something in the game and then got up out of their office and walked to somebody else's office and showed them, and then they would both come out of their office and go to somebody and you would see it. You would physically see virality. And that happened with those, what, stop, like all those goofy lines that happened, until a bunch of people walked into Alan's office and he came out and he's like, okay, what is this? Who put this in? And we're like, we just thought it'd be funny. He's like, oh, that's great. Like, that's in. And that kind of became like a trademark of the craft games, especially, right? And even in WoW, right? Even in Hearthstone, you could find spots where you click, and something happens. And to me, that's an extension of environmental storytelling. It's a thing you find, right? And it's that you discover. And I love that it's a payoff for players that also makes them feel smart, right? It rewards their curiosity and it makes them feel smart because they found a thing. Mm-hmm. They uncovered a mystery. They dug through the morass to find that gem. And that, I think, sticks with people. And that's what environmental storytelling should do.
That's brilliant. I love it. Another thing that, in my opinion, environmental storytelling has to do some of the heavy lifting for is setting the mood, the atmosphere, conveying a tone, creating emotions in players without saying a word, just through the environment. If you agree with me, because that's just my theory, how would one go about doing that?
I agree 100%. We specifically, in the demo we built for the survival game we're making right now, have moments that are purely environmental, right? Where you come around a corner and discover something. And it's not that it's about a jump scare or, but it's like, what it's to me always a sense of wonder pays off a lot of the time where you're like, what is that? Why is that there? Like, what does that mean? And then you are compelled to discover it. But when we set out to make the demo that we built, it wasn't about proving we know, like, here's the mechanics of a survival game. For us, it was a proof of concept that this is a world you are going to want to explore and learn more about and spend a lot of time in, right? And yes, your motivations to go through that is the fact that, it's a survival game, but it's a survival RPG. And what is that, right? And our extreme shorthand for it is it's Cowboys versus Cthulhu, and you get to be a werewolf. All right, well, that sounds pretty cool in the tin. What does that actually mean, right? So there's mechanical things that have to pay off with that. But I think more importantly, there is setting that has to pay off with that. And we've had people, when we talked about this concept very early on, that were like, is the American Old West like the Wild West too niche of a setting? And we would argue it's not. And we think there's movies and television shows and music and games that prove that it isn't. And then horror is another slice, right? Is that as accessible? Not for everybody, and then at the time we started talking with people about the very earliest days of the idea. It was like, oh, survival games, are they, so they were worried about this shrinking audience. Well, nobody argues about survival games anymore. Thank goodness. That's not a hurdle I have to jump with folks. But for us, that's why this demo was important, because to your point, there were times when I was walking people through the demo, we'd get to those moments and I would hear the people that were like, they had that intake of like, whoa, like, what's that? And there was, I remember one group I was showing specifically had every reaction I had hoped someone would have a reaction to. Like, they wondered what things were, but they were verbalizing it. And they were like, oh, that's really cool. What is that? Oh my God. Like, everything you hope for when you're creating those moments came out. And that's so gratifying as a storyteller when you get to see that or hear that happen. I think it's one of the best things about people streaming games, right? If you've made a game and you're like, I wonder, is somebody going to react to this the way that I hoped they would react to it?
Mm-hmm.
And when you see that, it's wonderful when you see it happen. It's gratifying. It helps you to make a choice. It's actually really good when you see it not happen too. Because if you're like, I put this thing here because I want it to evoke this emotional response, and then it doesn't, that lets you refine that response or change it. You see that a lot. I got to see that a lot when I was at Disney, and especially when we were spending a lot of time working with the folks at Pixar, and you'd get to go to a screening, or they're talking about some of the storytelling they're doing, and they'd say like, yeah, that's not going to work because we didn't earn that emotion. Like, they know there's switches they can flip to get someone to gasp or tear up a little bit, or like they know what they can do to trigger emotions. But if it's not earned, it rings hollow. And in the end, you're left, as opposed to like, oh my God, wow, what a journey. You're like, yeah, it made me cry a little bit, I guess. You end up with a different feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so translating that into things like environmental storytelling, it's like you want that earned emotional response. And so if you put something out there like, hey, I want someone to find this scene, to see this setting, there's a cabin in the woods and it's set up in such a way where, you're hoping people walk in and immediately are like, oh my God, what happened? Like, they're devastated. If they walk in and they go, whoa, this is pretty gory. You're like, okay, that's the wrong reaction. That's not what I wanted, right? So how do we dial that back? How do we change it? Because you're trying to paint it like an overall tapestry, like a whole portrait, right? A whole landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's bits that stick out or aren't, have the right brush strokes, or the colors are too garish, then that's just where your visual sense goes. In storytelling, if there's, it's always, I think, humor is the hardest balance in that too, right? Because you get that with environmental storytelling too, right? People can come across a thing that's just funny, right? Just like a setting, or, how a body's placed, if it's something like that, or a sign,
Mm-hmm.
or how someone's reacting to something, you have to have those moments, right? I think all good stories, even no matter how serious they are, have those, like, they're the sorbet course, right? They have those moments where you're like, okay, I get to refresh my palate, right? I get to lift out of that was pretty glum and grim.
Yeah.
I get to lift out of that. But knowing when to do those and how to do those are important too. So yeah, I love environmental storytelling. I love just doing it visually, right? Not even through someone said something, because that dips out of it. I think sound, though, plays a huge part in environmental storytelling.
Yep.
Right. And sometimes that can be, you hear someone saying something, but a lot of times it's just, what is the soundscape of the area I'm in as well? And how well does that either mesh with what's there or provide a provocative dissonance?
Mm-hmm. You got to be aware of all these things.
Yeah.
You mentioned
It's a lot.
It is a lot. You mentioned your Disney background, your time at Disney. I used to want to be an Imagineer a long time ago. So I've read all the books, watched all the documentaries, and then I've been lucky enough to talk to a couple of game designers who came from our Imagineers. And it didn't surprise me, but surprised me to learn that a lot of the principles they apply at the parks when it comes to squeeze and release and weenies, as they call them, that thing in the distance that draws you to, all these various different theories are very applicable to game design, especially to environmental storytelling. I'm curious, while you were at Disney, did you pick up any of these? Did you learn any of these?
Yeah, absolutely. The park itself is such an amazing feat of environmental storytelling, right? So the weenies you talked about, that's the term that gets used inside of Imagineering for what I think in video games has been called points of interest, right? Like, oh, there's a thing over there that is visually interesting and stimulating enough where I'm drawn to go see what that thing is, right? Yeah. The storytelling that they do at the parks through combinations of signage, through forced perspective, through weenies, right? It is phenomenal. I have a very good friend who I've known since college who got to realize that dream. His name's Scott Rogers. He's a game designer. He was an Imagineer as well. For a lot of years was trying to like build like gamification of areas of the park and things like that. And, you know, he's written like whole talks about, he has a whole talk on what you can learn as a game designer from the park. And there is so much there, you know, even from how they, and that's another great example of they use the soundscape to their advantage, right? When you just pay a lot of attention for anybody who, whether it's Disney World or Disneyland or any of the Disney properties, wherever you are in the world that you go to, like the next time you have an opportunity to visit, pay attention to the transitions, right? They're so good at moving you from one, especially in Disneyland, one land to another, right? And it happens. Sometimes it's almost imperceptible. You're like, oh, here's a tunnel I'm going into. Like going from, I think right now it's like Frontierland into Batuu at Disneyland when you go to the Star Wars land, right? It's like the transition that you go through, you're in this tunnel and then you're like, oh, the walls kind of change. And you hear a soundscape and then suddenly it's like, I'm in the Star Wars, right? And I think that's one of their best, if not their best, like lands, right? But I remember when they put in Cars Land, and I got to go see that because I was working there. So we got cast nights where we would go before stuff got previewed, before they were opened up.
Right.
And going there and like coming around, there's this big bend you kind of come around as you exit that kind of central food court area type thing. And then you look up and they've so brilliantly masked things like power poles. They've masked the outside world by how they build the background. And you are in Radiator Springs. And it's insane how good that is. And then even paying attention to things like when it's dusk, right? When sunset happens, they turn all the lights on the street like they do in the film. And it's such good moments of that. And, you know, the big thing that goes throughout every part of the park, kind of last thing that just popped into my head, that is a part of all that is the attention to minute detail, to rubbish bins, to sewer covers, to, you know, like there is no part of that park that someone hasn't thought about. And how does it fit? How does it make sense, right? That internal consistency we talked about. And they are masters of that. And now what you're seeing come out of Imagineering, because of, I mean, they're, you know, I've always thought they're the biggest technology part of the Walt Disney Company. And, you know, they're doing it with physical interaction. And the stuff they're doing now is just wild. There's a great YouTube series that's about Imagineering that just started. And all that is done by Walt Disney Imagineering. It's not on the Disney Channel. It's out over YouTube.
Yeah, I think I saw that pop up.
Yeah, and they've had like the first 1 or 2 episodes, and it's amazing. The stuff they're gonna, you know, they're kind of showing and talking about. Then the first episode is all about like the animatronics and how they put those together and build those. And they focus a lot on the new Princess and the Frog ride.
Okay.
And the detail and this goes along with that. One of the characters, if you watch Princess and the Bride, I can't remember the character's name, but there's a big crocodile who plays trumpet, who's in the thing. The animatronic they have for that character is so detailed on how like the stomach moves and the hands and everything. And just watching them test it, it's so emotive. There's no words happening, but immediately I'm hit with like an emotional sense and I'm transported to a place. And it's just like this frame of it moving because they've paid so much attention to how, in that instance, animation of that character creates part of the setting. Yeah, there's like no part of that park, of any of their parks you can go to where you will not learn about environmental storytelling. It's one of those places. I mean, originally when Walt came up with the idea for Disneyland, you know, it was because he went to Griffith Park and there was a merry-go-round that his kids would go on. And that's great because his kids would go on. And he was like, I wish there was a place where adults and children could play together and like experience together. And like that was the seed of, what became Disneyland. And so the thing that's fascinating is you can go and just find a bench and sit down and watch and see, how people interact. And it goes down to the cast members, when and the characters that walk around the park, like they all tell this big story together, and it was really funny when Disney, in 22 made this big announcement. They're like, oh, we're all in on the metaverse. I'm like, you guys have been in on the metaverse for decades, right? You just physically do it. It's the parks, where you've got these characters that, mix and mingle and everything's there. And I'm transported to an entirely different world when I'm there. Yeah, it's anybody. I think it's one of those things where I would really hope anybody who wants to be doing storytelling, especially in video games, environmental storytelling, find a way, if you have never been, especially, but like find a way to go to the parks and actually learn from that. And there's other theme parks that have started to really learn from that. Like I think at Universal Studios, Harry Potter is
Hogsmeade is good.
Like Hogsmeade is amazing. And actually, a little inside baseball, when that launched in Florida, that is what spawned Disney to make Star Wars what Star Wars is, because they had Imagineers go to that and they said, "This is more immersive than anything we've built. How do we beat this?" Because when you step inside a Hogsmeade, you are there. Mm-hmm. All I ever want when I go to Hogsmeade is more of it. I'm like, where's the next 30 acres of this experience? Because, wow, this is amazing, right? This is so good. It's so immersive. And it celebrates that IP, which is what Batu does. If you're a Star Wars fan and you go there, it's crazy. I've literally had 6 or 7 minute long conversations with characters, sitting having a
crazy,
having a Melloroon juice, and Fennec walks up and like talks to me for Ahsoka came up and talked to my kid, I swear, for 10 minutes. He's 7, cool. And I was just like, I'm thinking like this is an insane level of interaction, but the lifelong fan, first of all, and 2, I felt completely immersed. Like it that kind of stuff just works, right? That's more character based, but just the setting, right? Like you lose yourself in how complete that setting is. And when you're building video games, the more that you can pay attention to those things, the more where there's, you go into a house and there's things in the house that feel like they would actually be in a house. And because it's the dentist's house, there's books about dentistry, or there's, there's how funny that he's got like some award that looks like a molar that's like, best dentist 1943 or whatever it is, right? Whatever your setting is. Just those like little props that can be around, or maybe like the dentist's house is like really clean too. All the other houses you've been to are kind of disheveled because of your setting or something. And then like, even in a post-apocalyptic, this guy's house is really neat, right? Or whatever it is, like really does such a good job with that.
You can tell so much, even with just like a simple thing. Like you wander into a town and there's the sheriff's badge in the sand with a hole through the bullet holes through the middle of it. You just told the whole story.
Right. Suddenly, I've written in my mind as a player, I've written a whole account of what occurred here.
Right.
Right.
So powerful.
And the secret is it doesn't matter whether that's right or wrong, unless the sheriff's death is a part of some storyline you're telling. Right. But the fact that they found that and they're like, oh my God, what happened? Like, that you've just drawn them further into the world. Right. And the fun thing too is if you have an internal consistency to your world, right, you might say like, later on, I'm going to have them actually like find or run into the sheriff Maybe there's like an undead gunslinger that they run into somewhere, and then after they defeat him and they like loot the corpse, they find out like, oh, that was the sheriff. Oh, damn. Right? Like, oh, wow, oh, okay. Like, and even if those are two distinct moments, they're going to write in their head all the stuff that happened in between. Right? And that does so much heavy lifting for you. Like getting those little moments, right?
I love this stuff. I could talk about this forever.
That's why you started a podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, we probably should start bringing her towards the end here. We're going a little long. So I'm going to bring a wrap to the whole environmental storytelling thing and survival games. I want you to put on your see into the future glasses and tell me what excites you the most looking forward as far as environmental storytelling, survival games in general. What gets you excited?
I think the biggest thing that I'm excited about in terms of survival games and environmental storytelling is that we can now have the opportunity to move past the building blocks that survival games have laid out. They started with like, here's a setting, here's the core mechanic of survival games, here's an existential threat. Can you build a place that keeps you safe before the zombies, monsters, whatever, right, get you, right? I mean, even as Don't Starve or Minecraft, right? I mean, Minecraft initially, first thing you do is a survival game, right? Can you build a thing and keep the skeletons out at night? Right. Then you get to something like The Forest, and it's like there's weird, crazy abominations out there, and you build something that keeps them away. Or 7 Days. So but that kind of core mechanic and theme and pacing, like everyone gets it. That foundation is done. Right now, we're at the phase where what can we be doing to expand on that? Right. That's the core loop that we know people enjoy and is compelling and interesting. With us, and what I kind of see as part of this future of being is now how do you do a lot more storytelling within that context? It's not just about survival. It's about the interactions between the players and the environment, and more than just the existential threats that are there to do that storytelling. There's a reason, for example, that The Walking Dead is so compelling. And it's not just because it's like scary zombie survival. It's the characters, and it's the interactions they have, and it's the places they find, right? And how they use those or don't use those to their advantage. And I think that's, for me, where these games need to be going, right? Because already, if a new survival game comes out and it doesn't do something different or interesting from the core mechanic, I'm out pretty quick, right? It's got to have something else. And maybe that is a new take on the mechanic that's super interesting. Maybe it's crafting. Maybe it's resource gathering. Maybe it's the base building. Like, oh, wow, that's a really different twist on that. That's super interesting. But I think for these games to go to that next level and where survival games need to go, it's to look to other genres that have those high levels of emotional engagement and bring that in. I mean, survival gets your adrenaline up, and it's, it makes you think because it makes you want to explore, and it gets your adrenaline up. And now I want the emotional connectivity, right? Because that's the thing I feel is really missing in that as a core genre, is why do I care about that world, right? It's fun being there, but why do I actually want to be there? Why do I want to explore it? And if I've gone through and, one completed, gotten tired of, I don't know, survival games also kind of like MMOs in some ways tend to be pretty open-ended. Not all of them have storylines that end and things, but what's going to make me want to go back and do that again, right? And I think that's an interesting thing that you do see, for example, in a lot of open world RPGs, you can go through and play it and finish, and you're like, oh, I just feel like there was a bunch of stuff I didn't try, right? Or I would do differently this time around. And in survival games, I've done that, and the people I play with, we've done that, where we'll play something like, oh, hey, what if let's play it again, but this time let's try this. But it's kind of us setting challenges for ourselves, or, hey, what if we started here? Or what if we only did this? Or what if we focused on this time to see what that outcome is? But the thing I hadn't been drawn to yet is I want to play that again to see if my choices matter in a different way because I made different decisions.
Yeah.
Or what if this time I wonder if this time if we played, there's going to be something different in that area, right? Like I really feel like there's touchstones we can take from other genres of games that are much more focused on storytelling and put them either on top of, or more importantly, interwoven with the survival game mechanics. Because there is something incredibly compelling about I'm starting with nothing and I'm building up to something, right? And that's, whether that's finding food or making shelter, or, there's something about that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that's compelling to play through, right? And then if you can surround that with actual emotional connectivity and paying off the natural curiosity that I think especially gamers have, to me, that's like the next generation of what we should be doing in the survival game space.
I think you nailed it. Survival games, in my mind, are engine-building games. You're building an engine, and there's interesting ways to build the engine differently. I want to do this run through with using this or this, do a different build or whatever it is. And it'll be cool to see new innovations to that space. But I think you're bang on that when we figure out how to tie narratives like Last of Us or those really emotionally moving into a survival game where you discover the story along the way, that'll be powerful. And survival brings up questions of humanity, of who are we, what are we willing to do in order to keep going, what are we willing to sacrifice to protect others. You put that inside of that space and suddenly you've got something really powerful. And Sons of the Forest touched on pieces of it here and there, but I haven't seen it yet.
And I mean, but you can look at how well Sons of the Forest is done, right? I mean, they did like 2 million units in the first 24 hours, right? Because people played the first one and then they talked about what they were going to do in the sequel. I was like, that sounds really compelling. And so, I think that we'll continue to see survival games that do certain things and do them interestingly, or allow you to like have experiences that you always wanted but never got. I mean, Pal World is I want Pokemon with guns, right? Boom, it explodes, because that's a pent up, gamer need. I always wanted to do that. I'm like, I can't believe I can do it, right? But I think where you're going to get that, I've been playing this game for the last 15 years, right? And it never leaves my hard drive, is when you have that connection to it. I also think another thing that we've seen a little bit of that will also feed that is making sure that the game has the ability for modification, right? So that mods can get done on top of it. I look at something like Skyrim. The reason it's sold 80 billion copies, right? And people play it and stream it and everything this day is the fact that they've been able to go and make tweaks and tune things and incorporate their own ideas and, put those in. And I think that's another either alongside the storytelling or in, another path that's going to get taken, is having a survival game that comes out that acts almost more like a platform. Like that's part of Minecraft's success, right? No one even really thinks, I think, of Minecraft as a survival game anymore, right? It's a massive world building game, because that's where the focus and the excitement went. There's awful lot of people that never do the whole free first part anymore. They just go to free build, right? And that's the experience they want. And I think, though, when we see survival games, that there will be ones that embrace that we really want to pay off player creativity, not just in the scope of what they can do and build inside the world, but go make a bunch of cool stuff in the game. And then, the smartest companies then I think will find ways to highlight and promote those, if not make them like official parts of what they do. And there's companies that do that now, and I think it's really smart.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we probably should start heading for the door here. I don't want to eat up your whole day. So There is a question that I do like to ask everybody that comes on the show. It's the question that lives at the heart of the podcast. If you've listened to even a single episode, you probably heard it. And that question is, I personally believe there's a magical space at the intersection of story and game, Imagineering, board game design, comic book writing, improv, acting, music, all of these things where people can just naturally get together, hang out as a common language. If you agree with my theory, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds us all together?
I always think the magical thread that holds us all together is humor.
I like that.
And because no matter, and humor's hard. And it's hard to write, and what's funny to one person isn't always funny to other people. But those moments of joy that come from that, right? Like you can have these experiences that are dark and harsh and deep storytelling and emotional, and can make you cry and all those things that are so vital to storytelling. But the ones that always seem to stand out are the ones where everyone laughs together. And it doesn't have to be a super complex joke or a highbrow joke, or, it can be a moment where the tension of the story is released, where everybody has this shared moment. And those are always the stories within stories. People are like, oh, do you remember the time when? Right? They almost always stories. Remember the time when? Remember when such and such did that? And then everybody reflects back on that and laughs, right? And has that moment of like, oh, that was so good. All right, yeah. And to me, that's this thing that regardless of the medium, right? Comics, novels, films, television series, video games, music, right? That's a touchstone that reaches everybody, right? And every game I've ever worked on, I've always had to have those moments in there, and whether they're defined by a character or a location or a running joke, or just silly stuff like when I keep clicking on this character, they break the fourth wall. Some moment that everyone kind of can reflect on and just laugh about. Because at the end of the day, in what I do and in making video games, we're making games. Games are fun, right? There's a lot we can do with storytelling. There's a lot of emotions to delve and a lot of ways that we can approach engaging people. But for me, always at its core, it's been fun. And when I go back and think about learning to play cribbage with my mom, blackjack with my dad, yes, it was there for a purpose to teach me mathematics skills when I was young, but it was fun. And I had fun, and I connected with my parents, and we laughed. And, we would come up with funny things that we would say when certain cards got played, or there'd be like silly moments that would happen. And those are the ones that stick out in my mind. And I think for me, that's that magical thread that weaves all these things together.
I love it. That's a great answer. Well, my friend, we're going to start heading for the door. I do like to do a quick little quick fire just to pick your brain on what's going on. What are you currently playing?
Oh my gosh, I'm playing everything. I'm looking at my computer screen right now. The three things that are on here is I'm finishing my second run through Baldur's Gate 3.
Mm-hmm.
I've been playing too much and also not enough of Helldivers 2. And there's game series I always find out that for some reason I never played that were really popular. So I'm playing the first Saints Row right now. That's the video games I've got going on here on my system. I'm also hanging out, and I'm just more watching than playing, but my son is super into all the Zelda stuff, and he's reading all kinds of manga and everything about him, and so he's playing Ocarina of Time, so I'm kind of hanging out with him while he goes through that and plays that. That's a great blast from the past and realizing what I don't remember anymore about it. And then, of course, tons of tabletop. Right, everything from D&D to Traveler, all the touchstones. And I will probably always play that forever and ever.
Right on. What are you currently reading?
I am currently reading this amazing book, which is called The Ransomware Hunting Team. I grabbed it off my desk, it's about this group that actually works on creating fixes and breaking all the cryptography and everything around ransomware. And they don't do it for money. And it's an all-volunteer organization of these brilliant engineers from all around the world. And it's fascinating because it talks about like how they got formed and the early stuff they were cracking. And now, ransomware is pretty horrific in how it can disrupt not just major like companies, right? But individual people's lives and how that started. And like, these are people that just got together that had a particular set of skills and have applied that to helping people out and doing it because it's the right thing to do, not because they can make money off it.
Very cool. What's the best advice you've ever received? Could be life advice, could be career advice.
I think the best piece of advice I ever got was when we found out we were pregnant. And by we, I mean my wife, because I wasn't. And I had a very good friend of mine say, he's like, here's one thing I want you to remember. The days are long, but the years are short. And that is so applicable past just spending time with your kid and raising a child. But it really reframed a lot of how I thought about life. And the fact it's like, all of us, we've all had it. All of a sudden it's like, oh my God, where did the last 3 years go? Right. And you feel exhausted at the end of every day, but then suddenly this big chunk of your life is gone. So, it goes along with all those live every day and all those different things. But just, I really liked how that encapsulated it and it become much more applicable in a much broader way for me.
That's a good one. Okay, last fun question. If you could host a game session with any 4 people from any time in history, living or dead, who would they be and what would you play?
Oh my God. I would play. So first of all, I would play my favorite game of all time, which is poker. And if I could have 4 people at the poker table, I was playing probably Hold'em with. I'd pick my favorite poker player, which is Daniel Negreanu, because he's amazing. I would pick probably someone like Richard Feynman, so a scientist who also would just like loved life in a lot of ways. He's amazing. I've read a lot about him, and I think he'd be just a blast to have at the table. I would have, of a contemporary that I know, Todd Stashwick, who was on the last season of Picard, big tabletop guy. I've had the good fortune of meeting him a couple times and sat at a gaming table with him. And I just because I know he would be ridiculously fun to have at the table and do that with. And the 4th person would be my dad, because I think that one, he's been gone for a few years. The opportunity just to sit and play something with him would be irreplaceable. But I think that would be a table of people that would have a lot of fun playing and bring different elements to it. And it would also be great to see me be excited about playing with somebody that my dad has no idea who it is and how he would react to that. Because he would definitely just treat them like just folks. And I think that's an important lesson for everybody to have, right? Is like, underneath it all, we're all just people, so enjoy your time with people.
That's beautiful. We're going to walk out the door. There's nothing else to say. I do like to leave a little space here. Is there anything you're working on or anything you've worked on in the past you just want to promote or put a spotlight on for a moment? Obviously, we all got to keep our eye on Lunacy Games.
Yeah, absolutely. We're at that exciting stage where we're out we're looking for funding, from the business side of things. But I mean, I love what we're building. I love the people that I get to work with every day on those things. And I'm very fortunate. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And one of the things I love about making games is that there's always an energy. Like, things change all the time, but you can be really incredibly informed by all your successes and failures in the past. So please keep an eye on Lunacy Games. as we do that. If you are a fan of tabletop RPGs and you want to see me be a slightly goofy and also strangely disturbed character, you could watch us over on Severed Studios on. I'm going to have you edit that. If you want to watch me play a half orc, half drow, very funny at times, but also has a lot of weird stuff going on in his life, character, you could join us on Twitch on Severed Studios and on YouTube, which would be great because we're having a blast, and I think doing some amazing storytelling there. And, I think just the last thing is find some music you love, right? If you want to hear crazy, funny, a lot of times not safe for work, like kind of Celtic inspired music, you can check out my band, the Poxy Boggards. And we're anywhere that they will still allow our music to be. We're on all the streaming services and everything. But I think most importantly, keep some music in your life, right? The storytelling that gets done with music is unique. It is truly a universal language. So don't limit yourselves to the top of the pops, as they used to say. There's just some incredibly interesting stuff being done everywhere across the world, and it will expand your mind and expand your ability to tell stories.
Well, the expedition is drawn to a close, and everybody's ready to go to bed, so it's time to leave. Before we do, I want to say thank you to Bill for sitting down and sharing your wisdom and insights into the intricate art of storytelling inside of survival games. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, may you continue creating, sharing, and exploring worlds and stories. Stay safe out there, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.